Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In many years of hobby, I've jumped between various kinds of miniatures, from Lord of the Rings to Age of Sigmar to 3D printed minis. But until today, I had never painted a Warhammer 40k miniature, much less a Space Marine. And the main reason for this is that I've always found big enchanted swords, magic crossbows and majestic medieval armors so fascinating that I've always invested all of my budget into that kind of miniatures. Luckily enough, in the last few weeks in my country, a big Warhammer 40k collection was announced, where with just €2 you could bring home this amazing Captain in Terminator Armour and this Tyranid Prime. So I immediately thought, why not? I bought it, and now here I am, ready to paint my first Space Marine. The first thing I noticed is how incredibly detailed this miniature is. From the skulls located all around the armor, the surrounding crosses, the details on this sword, this is truly an amazing miniature that I hope I'll be able to do justice to. So enough talking and let's start painting it. As always, I primed it black, and the best thing to tackle first is going to be the armor. To do so, I decided that I'll stick with the original artwork. However, instead of relying on the Games Workshop classical edge highlighting, I'll be painting it using volumetric highlights. To better understand how light will interact with the shape of the miniature, I apply a quick zenithal highlight. This is incredibly helpful for understanding which parts will be most exposed to the source light, helping you place all the highlights in the right spots. As you can see, if I just applied some express colors right now, it will already have a good degree of depth with some well-defined shadows and highlights. You can also notice how I focus the brightest parts not only towards the top of the miniature, but also around some key areas where I want to focus the attention, such as the face. The first color that I'm going to use as base coat is Infantry Blue. Due to its dark blue tone, it will be perfect for creating deep and rich shadows. To start highlighting, I'll take a more vibrant dark Prussian blue. This color is particularly good because its more vivid blue tone means that when I add lighter colors to it, it will be easier to maintain its vibrancy. If I had used Infantry Blue, which has a more desaturated greyish tone, the color would have appeared dull and desaturated once I started adding the lighter colors to the mix. For the next layers, I proceed by adding blue to the previous color and thinning down the paint quite a bit. I found that, given the transparency of these layers, I can go back and forth over the same spot, applying more and more layers of the same color where I want to reinforce the highlights. To start pushing the highlights further, I add medium blue and later deep sky blue to the mix and apply it using the same technique. When edge highlighting, the drastic shifts from the darkest to the lightest tone are what help to create the effect. But in this case, where I'm trying to create a more realistic light shining upon the miniature, I will proceed differently, applying thin layers of paint and creating smooth transition to mimic how the light will naturally shine upon the model. This doesn't mean that I'm not going to cover the same range from the darkest to the lightest color. I'm just going to do it more gradually and focusing more on where the light is shining. Next, to bring the last touches of light and make this majestic power armor truly shine, I added a bit of ivory to the deep sky blue. But why ivory? Usually I will use a color like ice yellow for my final highlights, but in this case the yellow contained in it will turn my deep sky blue into a greenish tone. So ivory is going to give me the control I need. have to admit that being a big swords fan, I can't wait to paint this model weapon. I really like the stoic feel that this sword gives to the miniature. You can truly imagine what a powerhouse this captain is, and the amount of strength that this character needs to possess to wield and swing single-handedly such a massive weapon. To make justice to this sword, I'm going to paint it using non-metallic metal. To start, I applied a black base coat to have a very dark foundation, and from there I started sketching the main highlights, mixing it with some basalt grey. To finalize the midtones, I switched to pure basalt grey and start painting smaller areas. As always, to get smooth transitions, I add a nice amount of glaze medium and apply thin layers. Now that I have a nice midtone, I start pushing the highlights by adding some sky grey. As you may have noticed, this is quite a cold grey. I picked it because I think it's going to work perfectly alongside the blue armor, keeping the general tone quite cold, and creating a nice contrast later with the warmer tones of the gold. The last thing to complete a non-metallic metal worthy of its name is to add some small white dots in the most reflective areas of the blade. After this, I wasn't quite happy with the result. I mean, I really like the NNM that I got, but other than having some mess on the sword hilt that I'm going to clean later, I wanted to give it a colder tone and maybe incorporate some of the blue armor's reflection. For this reason, I diluted down some of the blue I used to paint the armor to a glaze consistency and applied it on the darkest areas, paying attention to apply just a light layer of it on the most highlighted parts. If you want to do this, make sure that the paint you're going to apply is very transparent over a piece of paper, your fingernail or the wet palette, before applying it to the miniature, potentially ruining everything you spent so much time building up. If the effect is too weak, you can always wait for your previous layer to fully dry and then apply all the layers you need until you're finally happy with your final result. Now that the sword has a nice blue tone, the only thing left is to paint the engravings. To do so, you just need to thin down some white paint to a watery consistency to create a bright base, and then do basically the same thing with any vibrant punchy color that you like. In this case I went for a light blue, but even an orange color would have worked perfectly. Having used the non-metallic metal to paint the sword, I will use the same technique to paint the Imperial Eagle and the other golden bits as well. To do so, I start by settling down a dark brown color using dark rust. This is going to lay down the perfect foundation for my shadows. Next, I need to start sketching the highlights by bringing in a warm, lighter grunge brown. What I prefer to do here is mix this color with the previous one, thinning it down a lot and applying various transparent layers, adding more grunge brown to it until I get to use only this color. Once I'm happy with the result, I bring in the next color and start the process all over again, reducing the painted area with each layer. In this case, I decided to progress using gold and yellow. In previous videos, I've already painted on metallic metal and I may have used different colors than this time. This is because there isn't just one universal recipe to paint it. Depending on the effect that you're aiming for, you can use different colors and even techniques. You may want a warmer orange gold or a colder greener one. Based on what you're trying to achieve, there are countless options. The final highlights are essential to boost up that non-metallic metal look. Here we want to get very bright, and to do so I pick one of my favorite colors, ice yellow. So I start applying it only on the most raised areas, followed by some dots of pure white. So far, I have to say that I'm really enjoying this painting experience. The miniature is very detailed, but also very cleverly engineered, so that all those details don't stand in the way of your paint job, and you still have space to create amazing blends and effects. Now, the tones of this NNM are a bit similar to a brown gradient, so to wrap it all together and create that rich gold effect, I'm going to glaze some hot orange all over it. I start by applying a uniform layer on all the surfaces at first, and once it dries, I apply more layers only in the shadow areas, that, due to their darker tones, are more difficult to impact with this filter. I choose this orange because I want to give a nice warm tone to this gold, in contrast with the silver sword and the blue of the armor. In addition to that, orange is also the complementary color for blue on the color wheel, and this is going to create a nice chromatic contrast, enhancing the vibrancy and intensity of these two colors. To finish off the job, I reapply some small white dots over the most reflecting areas. If you want a more in-depth look about this technique, check out these two videos that I've already published about this topic. For his majestic cloak, to keep it coherent with the original color scheme, I want to go with a nice red color, but with a twist. I want to use a purple color to set the underlying tone and shadows. I start by grabbing Evil Red and applying the base coat with a couple of thin layers. The choice of a purplish undertone will not only help me make the red pop, but also create a nice harmony with the cold tones that I've already painted. Here you can really notice the power of a well done zenithal highlight. If you just wanted a stunning piece on the battlefield, you could leave the cloak as it is, and it would already have a nice depth. I have to admit that seeing how Evil Red turned out, I was tempted for a moment to keep painting the miniature using mainly this color. But I have a vision in mind, and therefore I need to darken the shadows even more by diluting down some midnight purple and applying it in the recesses. Now that the purple tones are set, it's time to start building up the red tones, which are going to give it a regal look. I start by grabbing Nocturnal Red and applying it where I needed to set the midtones. Using very transparent layers of paint, I'm able to create a smooth gradient, which is great if you want to replicate that silky fabric look. At the same time, this will help me tint the midtones without losing a death purple look in the recesses. Proceeding to create the brighter highlights, I start adding vermilion to the previous red. Even though we usually think of red as a warm tone, in this case, I'm using a range of cold reds. This is because I want to keep some of the cold tones of the armor in the cape too. Now, to finish off the paint job, I start adding ice yellow to the mix. One thing that I immediately notice is that by doing so, the red is shifting towards a pink tone. In my mind, I wanted to have a stronger red, so I decided to take a risk and glaze some orange all over the highlights. This shifted the tones towards a richer red, and in addition to this, the warmth contained in the orange created an iridescent effect over the cloak, making it super interesting. At this point, I thought that the hardest part was gone. And I couldn't be more wrong. I want to paint the inside of the cloak in a creamy color, and even though there isn't a lot of it showing, leaving it black or unpainted would be very noticeable in the end. So I grabbed my paintbrush and started rotating the miniature into some impossible angle to reach all these critical spots. To minimize the pain, I just added a dark sand base coat and a couple of layers of highlights, adding ivory to the mix. We're almost there, but as you can see, we have an absurd amount of purity seals and skulls laid all over the miniature. For both, I'm starting with dark sand as a base coat and ivory for the initial highlights. I deliberately decided to paint these skulls as they were real skulls instead of golden emblems, to give this captain a darker look. To give the purity seals a more mystical aura, I applied a light blue glaze, the same I used to paint the engravings of the sword. To finalize the highlights, I just mixed more white into the blend. Now, those seals can't be considered completed without the prayers written all over them. So I grabbed a small paintbrush and a lot of patience and started scribbling down some thin lines. Over the shoulder pad and the knee, I also freehanded some writings, finishing it off by painting the red box. Before painting the face, this miniature holds a second weapon and some tubes and other details that I'm going to paint black. Here I mix black with basalt grey first, and then with some sky grey for the final highlights, paying attention to keep the direction of the light coherent with what I've already painted. When painting a model, most of the times, the main point of attention is the face. For this reason, other than putting a lot of effort into painting it, I use other techniques, like keeping the surrounding areas a bit brighter than the rest of the miniature. This not only sells the effect of the light shining from above, but also drives the attention over those areas. In this case, I apply a rather dark base coat using dark rose, paying attention not to fully cover the primer on the first layer. I want to keep some of that greyish rose in certain areas. To highlight the exposed side of the face, instead, I add some rosy flesh and light flesh to the base color, picking out the most exposed edges, such as the eyebrows and the cheekbones. My goal here is to create this shadow that the helmet is going to cast over the covered side of the face. To do so, I'm going to leave that area basically untouched, so that the greyish tone cast by the black primer through the pink first layer is going to help me sell that effect. When painting flesh, I always pay attention to connect the various skin sections, by highlighting all the areas where the various shapes meet. To give it the final touch, I added some elf flesh only on the most prominent areas. Now, I was finally happy with the miniature, until I flipped it back and saw the black areas of the jetpack vents. I simply couldn't miss the chance and leave them like that. So, I grabbed some white ink and applied it all over them, making sure it will settle in the recesses. After that, I diluted down some fluorescent orange and did basically the same thing. As you can see, at this point, they look a bit flat and not fiery at all. So to introduce a bit of shifting colors, I reapplied some white ink, but this time paying attention to hit only the central part of the vents. After it was dry, it was time for some lemon yellow. To finish off the fiery orange effect, I need to tone down the orange and the yellow a bit, by adding some red over the coldest spots. So I start applying a nice layer of scarlet red over the vents, and a mix of black and scarlet red over the parts that are the furthest from the hot core. As always, you can say a miniature is fully finished until you have completed the base, so now I'm going to do that. I start by applying a base coat of basalt grey all over the rock areas, and to create the shadows, I follow it with some black wash. Now, to give the rocks a bit more interest and a more natural look, I apply 3 washes: hot orange, lime green and blue green. These colors will mimic the various shades and tones you can find in nature, whether it be green moss, a different kind of vegetation, or simply a reddish or bluish shade of the rocks. After even this wash was dried out, I proceeded by applying some gentle highlights using a dry brush and adding progressively more sky grey to the mix. My fierce warrior is standing on the body of a fallen enemy creature, which I'm going to base coat using elf flesh. This very pale color works perfectly for my Tyranid lifeless body. To tint the skin a bit, I apply a thin layer using a Twilight Rose Express color. Mixing this glaze with some elf flesh, I start highlighting the skin. To complete the carapace, I paint it with a mix of black and heavy violet. Adding ivory and painting thin lines, I proceed highlighting it. I painted the ground surrounding the scene with a grunge brown, and this gave it quite a Martian ground feel. I'm going to accentuate this feeling by mixing some rust pigments with water and applying them on all the recesses of the base. To better blend in the pigments, I find it particularly useful to apply them on the designated area, and then, by using a moist brush, remove the excess, creating a smooth transition and avoiding paint blobs from accumulating in certain areas. This slain Tyranid definitely needs to get a bit more messy. So I went for my technical and special effects paint section and grabbed some blood for the blood god and dried blood. Using the blood for the blood god, I was able to recreate a dense pool of blood underneath the Tyranid's head and mouth. By stippling some dried blood effect over the areas further from the blood pool, I was able to mimic the effect of thinner and already dried out blood splatters. After a black layer over the rim of the base, this was the final result. Thank you for staying with me until this point. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Painting this miniature was an amazing experience, both because I had never painted a 40k miniature and because I gave it my 100%. I have to admit that I was surprised to see how detailed this miniature is and how well I was able to paint it. The details and the more flat areas are perfectly balanced, and even if it wasn't planned at first, painting this miniature at a very high standard helped me better understand not only the miniature, but also some little techniques and details about my painting process. I'm really happy with how this miniature turned out, and I have to admit that this is one of the paint jobs I'm most proud of. To think it all started just because I saw this miniature in the news kiosk made me think of how often we lose amazing opportunities to grow as painters and to try something new just because it's not what we're used to paint. If you enjoyed this video as well, please let me know by subscribing and leaving a like. Also, let me know down in the comments if you were lucky enough to find the same offer on this miniature, or if there's a miniature that you'd love to paint, even if it's not part of your main army of your usual wargame. Well, for today that's all, and until next time, don't forget to keep moving forward into this big minis world.